Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of a recorded lecture in Intro to Psychology. Today, we're going to be talking about social psychology, which is my favorite topic to cover. It's a really fascinating topic. It's one that's very dark, actually. We're going to see and talk about a lot of the darker sides of human nature. My goal for instructing you on social psych is to give you an appreciation for some of the things that being around other people can do to you and the way that it can affect your behavior and your beliefs, and also arm you with the knowledge so that you can fight against some of those tendencies as well. Just by understanding these factors that influence our behavior, we can recognize them and fight against them and not allow them to control us like they normally would. So far, we have discussed experiences and behaviors that have little to do with other people. It's mostly just how individual experiences, our individual psychology works. But a large part, one of the biggest parts of experience and behavior involves other people. The way that we interact with other people, the influence other people have over us plays a huge role in the things that we actually do and the things that we actually think and feel as well. We have a genetic predisposition to be social, which many of you are starting to experience right now. So what's funny about this study is it's extremely relevant for what's going on right now. So in a study in the 1950s, 5 people were asked to live without social contact for as long as they could. And one quit after 20 minutes. 3 lasted only 2 days, and 1 lasted 8 days. That's the longest that anybody lasted being completely socially isolated. So it's not the same as the social isolation that we're experiencing right now because we can still communicate with each other. This is even more. This is even more cut off than that. This is not being able to communicate with another person in any way whatsoever. And that's something that is extremely damaging psychologically. So, for instance, people who are in prison, who are put in what's called a hole, people who are put in isolation, those people are essentially being tortured. Really, I mean, it is horrible to be completely cut off from other people. And a lot of us are struggling with this right now. It's funny because there's actually a difference in the way that people react depending on whether or not they're extroverted or introverted. Introverted people, a lot of them either don't mind this situation or they actually are doing better when they're socially distanced. We're finding out throughout this whole process. And extroverted people are just in hell. I mean, I'm an extroverted person, so being socially isolated the way that we have been has been very hard for me, and I'm sure that many of you feel the same way about it. But again, the social isolation that we're experiencing is not the same as this study. So even introverted people do need to communicate with others. It's still important for their health the same way that it is for extroverted people. It's just that introverted people are a little bit more comfortable with being alone than extroverted people are. But social isolation or the threat of social isolation even can lead to poor choices such as unhealthy eating or poor performance. It can actually lower your scores in IQ tests just by being threatened by being socially isolated. It's one of the reasons why if somebody hangs up on you, for instance, it's one of the reasons why that's so powerfully upsetting a lot of times because you're being socially isolated in that moment. You can see how social humans actually are and how much we require we require to the situations where we're around other people. It's sort of interesting how that works. Um, when people were excluded in a game, their brain showed activity in regions that are active during physical pain, believe it or not. This is when you're excluded from a group, for instance, this is something that's called ostracism. So this is where you want to be part of a group and you're not allowed to be. And it's extraordinarily hurtful when people are in these situations. It's actually something that can have some pretty drastic effects on your psychological well-being just by being socially isolated in that way. So a lot of the work on ostracism is done on children because it's very common for children to be ostracized from social groups. And you can see that your brain responds to it the same way that your brain responds to tissue damage when you're socially isolated from people. See once again how powerful these social factors are in our own experiences. So, social factors also play a role in our performances. So, there are two different effects that being around other people can have on the way that we perform on tasks and in the things that we're doing. So, the social facilitation effect is one where you you actually perform better when you're in groups. So cyclists, for instance, race faster when they race with other cyclists. Even cockroaches complete a maze faster when other cockroaches watch them, which is interesting. So you can see the same sort of social factors at play even in other animals. And this is true of most things that we do. The only exception is when we have certain types of social anxiety that can hinder these social facilitation effects, but most of the time, when you're around other people, you tend to do things better. Another exception to this is if you're not confident in the thing you're doing, it can actually have the reverse effect. So, in that case, the presence of other people can actually inhibit your performance and it'll hinder your ability to do what you're trying to do. And this usually happens for behaviors that are less well practiced. Right? So if you're doing something that you're already not very comfortable with, then the presence of other people might make you do worse than you otherwise would. This would be the social inhibition effect. But most of the time, if you do things in groups, you'll do better at it. So it's good to do study groups, for instance, because having the accountability of other people will cause you to study more. It's good to have exercise groups because once again, that will almost always facilitate the exercise. So being in groups, if you need to perform on something, is something that's always useful. So I definitely recommend doing that anytime you can, trying to get groups of people together so that you can do better and do more of what you want to do. So, getting into some of the more darker sides of social psychology, we're going to talk about stereotypes here. So, when very little information is present, we tend to use certain factors about individuals to judge them. We tend to use them to understand how we should interact with them, to predict what they might do, to surmise the type of person that they might be, and these preconceived notions that we have that influence the way that we interpret other people is are called stereotypes. And the things that we typically notice first about someone else are these factors: their gender, so whether or not they're male, female, or other. Whether or not they are dressed shoddily or dressed well. This is something that influences our opinions of people pretty quickly, is the way that they dress. People's race is something that we notice immediately, and we use racial stereotypes to interpret people. This is, by the way, these are all things that they kind of happen. They kind of happen without us knowing that they're happening. Sometimes we stereotypes work in a sort of a subconscious, covert way on our beliefs, and we all have stereotypes that we recognize immediately. Um, it's really our ability to it's really what we do with that information that defines us. So it's important to recognize that we have these stereotypes, but that we are able to fight against their influence over the way that we treat and think about other people. Another thing we notice is people's age. There's all sorts of stereotypes that exist around that. And a couple of other things that are a little bit less well known are people's posture. So this has a pretty immediate effect over the way that we interpret people. So you can look at this person's posture right here, and you can surmise kind of how they feel, right? And you can, in particular, surmise what's the best way to interact with them. This person looks, of course, very closed off. So it's not someone that you would likely want to approach if you just saw them, right? So they're probably somebody who doesn't necessarily want to talk to you. Another really important one is people's facial expressions. So we recognize facial expressions very quickly. It's one of the things that um, we are biologically predisposed to noticing and reacting from. So you can tell what people are thinking really quickly just by the look on their face, and we use that information to determine what sort of social interaction we should have with them. They can let us know whether they're happy, sad, upset, disappointed. We can see all of these things just in the look on their face. Why is it, do you think, that we notice these things first? There's got to be a reason why humans use these stereotypes in order to interpret other people. And I particularly want you to think about why they might be useful. And the answer to that question is that they are useful because we don't have a lot of information about people when we don't know them. So we can use these sort of mental shortcuts, they're known as heuristics, more specifically in psychology, in order to get a sense of how we can actually interact with people. It gives us a lot of information about people right away. Because of that, mental expediency that we have, we're very prone to using them. But like I said before, they're not something that we have to use. They're something that we do in fact use in order to interpret other people, but it's something that if we recognize, we can work against, and we cannot allow them to influence the way that we treat others or the way that we think about them. As a matter of fact, appearances matter a lot when it comes to the way that we judge others. Um, People are less likely to ask for help or to offer help to someone who looks ungroomed or sloppily dressed, or somebody who is, um, I'm sorry, for somebody who is neatly dressed and well groomed, we tend to be more likely to help that person. We also oftentimes assume that attractive people are more intelligent and more sociable. That is a stereotype that exists about people who are considered stereotypically attractive, is that we kind of think about them as just like having more positive characteristics. That's one of the assumptions that we make about those individuals. And attractive people even get carded when they buy alcohol less. It's interesting the way that society treats people of varying degrees of attractiveness, the way that society defines attractiveness. But why are appearances so important? Why is it that the way that we understand how to interact with people is influenced so much by the way that they look? The info is often combined with information stored in our long-term memory. This information about social groups and about social situations are called social schemas. You remember from developmental psychology, we talked about schemata. That's how they define that term in social psych, or I'm sorry, in developmental psych. In social psychology, they're called just schemas. And what schemas are groups of information that we have about a given person or a given social group or about a given social situation. So you have schemas about race, you have schemas about gender, you have schemas about facial expressions, all the stereotypes we talked about before. You also have schemas about how to act in a classroom, or how to act when you're playing a sport, or how to act when you are at a restaurant. We have all of these expectations about those situations, and they're stored in our long-term memory just like everything else is. So when we experience the characteristics that activate those schemas in our long-term memory, then it activates all of that information that's associated with it, just like we talked about in memory. So a schema for homeless people is that they may sometimes be dangerous. That might be some assumption that you have stored with your social schema about homeless people. And of course, social schemas can be wrong, but when there is no other information to go on, we often rely on them the same way that we do all other stereotypes. And once again, the reason why we do this is because it is a really shorthand way of being able to get a lot of information that informs us on how we should behave in a given situation. They shouldn't be used without caution. We should always try to fight against our kind of predisposition that we have to read a book by its cover, but we do have to recognize that it's a natural part of the way that the human mind works. Once social schemas are activated, we may expect members of a group to behave in a certain way. Right? So once we see someone who looks homeless, for instance, we might assume that they're going to behave in a certain way that's consistent with our stereotype for homeless people. But how we expect people to act determines how we act toward them, right? If you expect a homeless person to be violent, for instance, that means that you're going to act in a way that is sort of cautious around them or maybe sort of avoidant of them, right? So it causes your expectations cause you to act a certain way. And the way that you act towards someone else causes them to sometimes act in a way that's consistent with that social schema that you have. So we're actually putting people in a situation where they're likely to behave in the way that we expect them to. In some cases, our expectations cause us to act in such a way that encourages other people to act the way that we expect. And so if we think someone's going to act that way, we're going to treat them as if they're going to act that way, and that might cause them to actually act that way. Let's take this example here, where an individual is asked to have a phone conversation with Marcy over here, and he's given a picture of Marcy, and of course Marcy is looks like Holly Berry here. So what the guy here is thinking is, okay, she's attractive. So my stereotype for attractive people is that they're intelligent and likable. So because of that, when Bill actually talks to Marcy, thinking about her looking like that, Marcy actually looks like that. He might say, "Hi, Marcy. I'm really glad to be talking to you." And Marcy, of course, because Bill is so nice, is saying, "I'm really glad to be talking to you too, Bill." And then Bill, of course, thinks that, oh, I was right. She is a likable person. It's because Bill treated her with the expectation that she'd be likable. It caused him to be nice, which caused Marcy to be nice in return. This is called the self-fulfilling prophecy effect. It's where we have an expectation about someone and we use that expectation to behave towards them, and that produces them to behave in the way that we expect them. Let's switch the scenario around a little bit here and see what happens. So let's say that Bill is given a picture of Marcy that looks like this, obviously somebody who's not stereotypically attractive. And Bill is thinking, okay, she's not attractive. I'll bet she's not very likable because of his social schema, because of his stereotype about people that are not stereotypically attractive. And so when Bill is talking to Marcy, thinking that she looks like this, he might say, "Hi, Marcy. So do you like stuff?" And of course, Marcy's response is, "Yeah, I guess I like stuff." And then Bill's thought here is, "I was right. She isn't very likable." So you can see how the way that Bill expected Marcy to act influenced the way that he acted, and in return, influenced the way that she acted. So what's going on in this scenario? What's going on is that Bill thought that Marcy was unattractive, assumed that that meant that she wasn't likable. So he treated her as if she wasn't likable or that he didn't like her. And it, of course, caused her to reciprocate that in return. The things that we hear about someone first, or the information that we get about somebody right away, has a pretty heavy influence over how we feel about them. One of the myths about psychology that's actually true is that first impressions are lasting impressions. It is definitely the case that the first impressions we have about people have a very powerful influence over the way that we think about them going forward. So, in an experiment conducted in the 1940s, two groups of people were introduced to a hypothetical person. In one group, they were told that the person is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. You notice that the first three characteristics of this person are positive ones, and the second three are negative ones. In Group B, the exact same qualities were described about this person, except the order of the good versus bad information was reversed, so that the bad information was given first and the good information was given second. After that, they were asked to rate how likable the person was. You can see in our little graph here, we have likability on the vertical axis and Group A and Group B on the horizontal axis. And who do you think they liked more? Well, of course, they ended up liking the person more where they got the good information first and the bad information second. Just that first couple of things that you hear about someone is something that's going to very powerfully influence the way that you think about them. So most of you have probably had this experience before where you've had a bad experience with somebody the first time you meet them, and then it's really hard to not think about them in those negative terms afterwards. That's what this effect is here. It's also the case that if you have a good interaction with somebody the first time you meet them, that if you find out bad stuff about them later, you're going to be less likely to consider that bad stuff as bad as you otherwise would. And that's exactly what's going on here. Are you reminded of anything that we studied in memory when we talked about that? You might be thinking about the serial position curve. Remember the primacy effect, where we actually remember information that's at the beginning of the list better than we do the middle of the list. That's because we're able to actually record that information into our long-term memory. This could also be, partially what's going on here is that people are just encoding this information better when it's the first thing that they learn about someone. So that maybe is part of the reason why it has such a long-term effect over how you consider another person. So there's also some really interesting research in social psychology on attractiveness. So some research has suggested that our tendencies to find other people attractive are genetically programmed and that they're actually based on evolutionary principles. So they're based on characteristics that lead to a greater degree of successful reproduction. So, for example, consider the following facts about attractiveness for men and women. So, men prefer to date women who are young and physically attractive, and women prefer to date men who are dominant, mature, and wealthy. This is not true across the board. There's individual differences in people's attractiveness profiles, but it's generally true about the way that most people find others attractive. I will say that some of it too is not that like someone personally feels like these are attractive characteristics, but a lot of people recognize that this is how a lot of people feel and how it's like the social expectation of attractiveness. And that sort of plays a role in this as well. And the idea here is that such preferences are genetically programmed because they foster the well-being of offspring and the survival of the species. Right? A woman who is young and attractive is more likely to carry a baby to term, and a man who is wealthy and mature and dominant is more likely to be able to protect the family, and also more likely to be able to earn enough money to keep the family, alive as well. Obviously, this is extraordinarily misogynistic. It's one of the reasons why it's so controversial because it's not necessarily true, and it also really kind of it bolsters some of the more uh, sexist ideas that exist in our society. And there's a ton of other theories that do, I think, a better job of explaining attractiveness. But this is a theory that does exist as well. It's one of the theories that a number of psychologists, especially evolutionary psychologists, ascribe to. So another thing that's important for us to be able to do is attribute causality to the behaviors of others. One of the first decisions we need to make about another person is what is causing them to act the way that they do. It's important because it allows us to understand how we should interact with that person. It also allows us to be able to form an opinion about that person's behavior that can guide the way that we interact with them going forward. So why is this person dressed like this? As far as I can tell, there's a couple of different possibilities. One is he's dressed like this because he's a weird person, right? Probably if you saw this guy at like a supermarket somewhere, not during football season, you might have this thought. You might be like, why is Raider Dave, walking around in full regalia right now? There must be something wrong with him. There's something weird about him, right? This type of attribution is called an internal attribution. This is where you attribute someone's behavior to something about them personally, something about their psychology, or something about their even mental state and well-being. The other possibility, of course, is to think or attribute this behavior of Raider Dave here to the situation. Right? So he's dressed like this because he's going to go to a Raiders game. In that case, you're making an external attribution. So you're attributing his behavior to something about the situation or the context that he's in rather than who he is as a person. Which one of these attributions do you think we're more likely to make? Well, we'll find out here in a second. People tend to make internal attributions more often. This is what's known as the fundamental attribution error. It's where we overestimate the role of internal factors in the behaviors of others. My favorite example of this is driving in your car and somebody cuts you off, right? What are you likely to say when somebody does that? Usually you'll have a few choice words for that individual when they cut you off, and you'll assume naturally sort of that they're doing it because of something about them, because they're an asshole, right? That you're thinking to yourself. But the person driving is thinking, I'm not a jerk, I'm just in a hurry, right? So they're actually making an external attribution and attributing their behavior to the situation. And the reason why the fundamental attribution error is in existence is because it's another sort of mental shortcut, just like first impressions and stereotypes. When we don't know another person, we are more likely to attribute their behaviors to themselves because we don't understand these details of the situations that they're in. So it's hard to attribute their behavior to the context that they're in. And it's actually the case that as you learn more about another person, you become more and more likely to make external attributions about them, to attribute their behavior to the situations that they're in. And for ourselves, we're also more likely to make external attributions. We tend to attribute our behaviors to other people rather than, attribute our behavior to the situations we're in instead of attributing it to some sort of aspect of our personality or ourself. So another thing that social psychologists study are attitudes, and they help us remain consistent in our behaviors. It's one of the functions of attitudes. So we have these beliefs, these feelings towards things that cause us to behave in ways that are normally consistent with those attitudes that we hold. But what happens when our attitudes and our behaviors conflict with each other? So acting in a way that is inconsistent with an attitude creates this mental tension, this sort of uncomfortability that we feel when we do this. And this is what's known as cognitive dissonance. And I'm sure that you've heard of this term before. It's a little bit complicated, actually, even though in some ways it's pretty straightforward and simple. But if there's a mismatch between what you feel, which is your attitude, and what you do, which is your behavior, then you experience this mental tension known as cognitive dissonance. in our classic experiments, college students were asked to perform really boring tasks like counting pennies. Nobody wants to do that. Counting like 100 pennies would suck. So they had college students do this. What we do in psychology oftentimes is have our participants do really, stupid or boring or disinteresting things, if any of you haven't already noticed that. So, of course, people have an attitude towards this task that suggests that it's boring. It's something that they don't like doing. But for half of the participants, they were asked to lie to the next participant in the study and tell them that the task was really great. Tell them that they had a lot of fun doing the task, that they enjoyed it. The other half of participants were asked not to lie. So they were able to talk about how boring the experiment was to the next participant that came in. After doing this boring task, both groups were then asked how enjoyable they thought the task was, which of course naturally they would, think was pretty low. That it's not a particularly enjoyable thing to do. But what they ended up finding here was that the group who were asked to lie and say that the task was fun actually rated the task to be more enjoyable, which is pretty fascinating, right? And why is there this difference between Group A and Group B? Why does Group A say that the task was more enjoyable than Group B does? What do you think is going on in this situation? Well, for Group A, the only way to remove the inconsistency between the attitude and the behavior was to change their attitude to match their behavior. In this scenario, the cognitive dissonance that they experienced was that their attitude was that the task was not fun, and their behavior was the opposite, that it was fun. So what they ended up doing was changing their attitude to match their behaviors and rated the task as being more enjoyable, which is very fascinating. It's crazy how you can kind of manipulate the way that people feel about things by taking advantage of this cognitive dissonance that we so here's an example that is probably a little bit too dated. I think I should replace this one, but you'll get the point, I think. So the Eagles and the Falcons are in the same conference. So when they play each other, obviously the Eagles fans are going to boo them, right? They're going to feel bad about the other team, and they're going to feel good about the Eagles. Michael Vick was on the Falcons originally before he got caught up in the horrible dog fighting scandal that put him in prison for a while. And in this case here, when Michael Vick was a Falcon, the Eagles fans were probably booing him, right? And then, of course, when he gets caught up in the dog fighting scandal, the Eagles fans are feeling even worse about him. They think he's even more horrible, right? So because of that. But then Michael Vick, for a few years, actually became an Eagle, and so the Eagles fans were in a position where they had to kind of cheer for him, right? So they had to actually root for Michael Vick to do well because they're still rooting for their team. So their behaviors have to change towards Michael Vick, and that's actually going to cause their attitudes towards him to change as well, right? That's something that naturally happens. Then he became a Jet, and of course, at that point, you drop him again and start booing him and feel bad about him, and all the stuff he did is with dogfighting is bad again, and that's how the sort of attitude and behavior mismatch can kind of flip flop over time as cognitive dissonance is created. I think probably a better example of this that is something that probably hits home a little bit since a lot of you are Cubs fans which, by the way, I'm a White Sox fan, so get out of here with that. But for their World Series run, they acquired Aroldis Chapman, who is seemingly a bad guy as well, who was embroiled in some domestic abuse scandal right before he came to the Cubs. And for Cubs fans, when he came, many of the Cubs fans, obviously didn't like the guy before he came, and still didn't like him when he did come. But having to root for his success probably changed their attitudes a little bit towards him. right? If you were to have Cubs fans rate their attitudes, the likability of Aroldis Chapman when he was a Yankee, it would have been really low. But rating it when when he was a Cub probably didn't go up to 100%, but it did probably go up a little bit. There's probably a little bit of change in that attitude to match the behaviors that they were engaging in because of the cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a very powerful thing. So another example of cognitive dissonance is one that's exploited by salespeople sometimes. So you can see in this sales technique what how they were using cognitive dissonance. So hello, I'm taking a survey of attitudes about the environment. Do you think a clean environment is important? Yes, of course I think a clean environment is important. And then of course then comes the ask. So excellent. So we can count on you for a donation to support the new recycling center, right? And you're in a situation where you kind of say, yeah, sure. And what's going on here? What's going on here, of course, is that the first question about his attitudes toward the environment created the saliency. It sort of highlighted an attitude that he had, and then it created a situation where him saying no to supporting the thing that he said he has a positive attitude towards was going to create cognitive dissonance because his behavior, if he didn't donate, was going to be inconsistent with his attitude about the environment. Right. So it makes it more likely that cognitive dissonance, that discomfort you feel when that happens, is going to push you towards changing your behavior in this case, actually, to match your attitude. So now we're going to get into some of the most dark stuff that exists in psychology. It's all very fascinating, and it's all very important to know about. But it is, some of it kind of terrifying. So other people can make us do all sorts of things without us understanding that they're making us do those things. In a classic experiment in the 1950s, a researcher asked participants to be in an experiment on visual perception. So they were shown a display that looked like this, and they're actually shown, I believe, like pieces of paper that had these options on there. And the participants were asked to look at each line and say which one is the same as line X, right? Shouldn't have much problem with this one. Of course, in this case, line B is the correct answer. And it's pretty obvious what the correct answer was in all of these examples. They performed this task in a group of 3 or 4 people. The twist on this study, and by the way, social psychologists are always tricking their participants. It's a part of social psychology. They're almost always deceiving their participants, which I find pretty funny. But this is an example where they were in fact tricking their participants. The study was not actually about visual perception. Only one of the participants out of the 3 or 4 of them was actually a real participant. The rest of them were actors working for the experimenter. These are known as Confederates. And they were told to give the wrong answer on a random number of trials. So on some of the trials, they are asked to just say that the obviously wrong answer was right. Most participants lost confidence in their ability to judge length on these trials. So the participants agreed with the wrong answer a third of the time. A third of the time, they went with what the group said instead of trusting their own clear experience in this example. And there's a couple of links in here on slide or on videos that you should definitely watch. They're pretty interesting, and the elevator one is really funny. And this tendency to act in accordance with others is called conformity. So this is a word that you're probably all familiar with, but it is also a technical term in psychology, and it's our tendency to do the same things that other people are doing. So this is a photo of the original experiments, and you could probably pretty easily tell who the real participant is. It's the one in the center there who looks shocked and confused, trying to figure out what everyone else is seeing, and then likely actually giving the same answer, the same wrong answer as everybody else. So It's just like it's just like your mother always says, if all of your friends were jumping off a bridge, would you do it? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. A third of the time, as a matter of fact, you might jump off the bridge with them. And conformity is something that's just like a lot of these other social psychological effects. It's very very powerful. So we are always always being pressured just by the presence of others to conform. And it's important for us to recognize this in ourselves. And it's important for us, of course, to question whether or not we should conform. Right? It's good to make sure that you're checking yourself, making sure that you're not acting on something just because somebody else is, and that you're making decisions about what to do based on your own ideas about what's going on. And it's hard to do because the pressure to conform is pretty great. But it's good to try to find that strength and make sure that you're not always acting in accordance with what other people are doing. So these are just some links to some resources for you to check out. I definitely want you to watch all of these videos. They're all really useful and interesting. Some of the things we've talked about already, and some of them we'll talk about here in a second. But I just wanted to point this out in the middle here so that you don't forget to take a look at them. So this is my favorite experiment in psychology. It is extraordinarily frightening, and the implications of it are very dark and sad in a lot of ways. But it's a brilliant experiment, and it's also just so incredibly powerful. So in the 1960s, a researcher recruited pairs of participants to be in an experiment on what they thought was memory. This is what the ad looks like for the experiment. They paid participants $4 an hour to be a part of it, and they recruited a bunch of people to run in this study. 40 people, as a matter of fact. One person is assigned to be the teacher, and the other person is assigned to be the learner. So you can see a teacher and learner here. The learner's job is to memorize short lists of words, just like we did when we were talking about memory. Remember that? The learner tests the teacher by asking for a missing word on the list. Right? So they ask them whether or not a word was on the list, is what they did. The interesting part of this study is that if the learner makes a mistake, the teacher is required to give them an electric shock, and the voltage of that shock increases after every mistake. Pretty insane, right? So this was the pretext for the study. So this is what the dial looked like in front of the teacher. You can see that the shocks increased in voltage, going from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. And every time the learner made a mistake, you had to increase the voltage of the shock. And 450 volts is going to kill most people. It's probably a fatal electric shock that would have been given if it was really given. If the teacher hesitates or shows concern for the learner, the experimenter would step in and tell the teacher the experiment must continue. You have no other choice, right? So just the experimenter acting as an authority figure telling the teacher that they have to continue to do this. The learner is actually an actor, just like in the conformity study, and is not being shocked at all. He's just pretending to be shocked. And he's also making mistakes on purpose and following a script during this experiment. The question that Stanley Milgram, who is the researcher on this study, was asking was, how far will the teacher go in providing shocks just because an authority figure told them that they had to keep doing it? Here's the shock panel, and let's go ahead and take a look at how far the participants would go. So for the lowest shock, all of them did it. So for the 15-volt shock, everybody shocked the learner. The mild shock at 75 volts, everybody's still on board. The strong shock at 150 volts, where the learner would be in substantial pain when they experience this, everybody did it. And how many people do you think actually shocked the person to a point where they would be dead? As a matter of fact, more than half of them did this. At this point, the learner wasn't even responding anymore. As far as the teacher knew, the learner was dead. And yet, 26 out of 40 of them still shocked him. That is just, it just blows my mind. It's so terrifying that that's the case. The only thing that was causing them to move forward with this experiment and continue killing this person was just the experimenter telling them to do it. That's it. That's the only thing. I mean, this was groundbreaking research at the time. It's still something that blows people's minds when they learn about it. And this tendency to respond to authority like this is called obedience, and that's exactly what people were influenced by when they were in this experiment. And it's very fascinating. The original the original sort of impetus for this experiment was all of the atrocities that were committed during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. The Milgram asked the question of what social factors would cause so many people to participate in such a horrible thing. And it seems that one of the key things that's caused them to be able to do it was just somebody with authority telling them to do it. That's all it took. I usually demonstrate this in class before I explain the experiment by having all of you, stand up and telling you to stand on one leg, telling you to do a curtsy, telling you to spin around in a circle, telling you to touch your head and rub your stomach, and everybody always does it. And I ask the question afterwards of why. Why did you do it? And the answer, of course, is because I told you to. And I am perceived as an authority figure in the classroom, so you do what I ask. And I ask, my students whether or not they would have done it if one of their classmates asked them to do it, and they always say no. And the reason for that is because their classmate is not perceived as an authority figure. So the important lesson that I want everyone to take away from Milgram's work and from the concept of obedience is that we should always question our authority figures. We shouldn't just blindly follow what our authority figures want us to do, because some people will abuse that power they have over you to put you or other people in danger. So you want to make sure that you are checking whether or not you're doing things because of this powerful obedience that we're very sensitive to, or whether or not you're doing it because it's actually something that you want to do. If you're ever asked by somebody in control or in authority to do something that you don't want to do or you're not comfortable with, you need to make sure that you fight against this urge that you have to follow the orders of these people in power. So that is something that you want to make sure you definitely take away from this. Always question authority figures, never just blindly follow them. So other people can make you do all sorts of other weird things. So this is a phenomenon known as de-individuation. So this is the riots in Chicago after the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup in 2013. You can see people damaging property. You can see them breaking things. You can see them stealing things. And what ends up happening in big groups, the thing that actually causes riots to take place in the first place, is that the more people we are around, the more diffused our sense of accountability is for our actions. We feel like we're less responsible, or the responsibility is diffused across the number of people involved. So people actually act as if there's no consequences to their actions. Now, that's what causes these types of things to take place. And it's another thing that we can fight against, right? If you feel if you understand that you're feeling a little bit less accountable for your actions, you can still fight against that and hold yourself accountable for your actions. So understanding the influence of de-individuation can cause you to be a little bit less susceptible to it. So in the early 1970s, a researcher was interested in how roles, expectations about how we ought to behave in a given situation, affect behavior. College students were recruited for an experiment. Half were chosen at random to be inmates in prison. They were arrested, booked, and asked to wear prison jumpsuits and live in cells under a set of prison rules. The other half were designated as guards, and they wore uniforms, carried nightsticks, and were instructed to enforce these prison rules. Sure, all of you are recognizing this experiment right now. This was known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. There's a movie about it that's definitely a good watch. I'd recommend checking that out. And what they ended up finding in this study was that the prisoners or the guards, just because they had the role designated as a guard, would do all sorts of terrible things to the prisoners. I mean, they knew the prisoners weren't actual criminals, and they still did things like this, where they made them wear paper bags or made them do push-ups, humiliated them, made them feel less emotionally and psychologically, abused them. They did all of these things to these people that they knew were innocent, just because of the power of the role that they had. And you can see it's pretty similar the way they treated these prisoners in here to the way that the way the prisoners were treated at Guantanamo Bay. Actually, you can see the sort of morbid similarities between the way that these guards at the at the at the prison in Iraq acted, and also the way that the guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment acted. You can see the similarities even more starkly here, the way that they embarrassed them and the way that they dominated them. They ended up having to discontinue the Stanford Prison Experiment study because it was traumatizing for the prisoners. They also fell into their role as well. They knew they were innocent, but they still became very subservient and docile, and it was just because of the role that they were given, which is, you know, pretty crazy. It's roles are things that we all have. Roles have a social schema associated with them, a set of expectations about how we should behave. I act differently in my role as a professor than I do as in my role as a son to my parents. And you all have multiple hats that you wear as well, and they all influence the way that you behave differently. So it's important to understand the power of those roles and make sure that some of those more dangerous expectations you might have in those roles don't cause you to do bad things. Right? Zimbardo, who was the scientist who organized this experiment, actually testified as an expert witness during the trial of the soldiers at the prison in Iraq. And why do you think he did this? Oh, of course he did it because he was arguing that at least some of the responsibility for the guards the guards' abuse of the prisoners was due to the role that they had. Of course, that doesn't excuse it, and it's not the best defense that exists, but it was certainly something that played a role in the way that they treated the prisoners. So finally, the last thing we'll cover here is the bystander effect, which is very interesting. So just like in de-individuation, where the responsibility for your actions is distributed across as many people that are present socially, the bystander effect works very similarly. So if you walk by someone who needs help and you're the only one there, you are pretty likely to help that person. It's something that you're probably going to do. Right? But if you're in a busy street in downtown Chicago and you see somebody who needs help, and there's hundreds of people around, you are exponentially less likely to help that person. And that's because the responsibility for helping that person is distributed across all of those people. You almost consider yourself in some ways to be a part of this kind of hive like social network when you're around other people, where your actions are influenced by them as if they're a part of you, and you distribute some of the psychological factors across those groups of people. And so the bystander effect is one where somebody is actually less likely to be helped the more people that are around. Because the more people that are around, the more the responsibility and accountability is diffused across them. Is this callousness or immorality? Is this happening because people are not kind enough, not compassionate enough? Or is it something that's more complicated? Of course, the bystander effect could also be due of course, like somebody not helping somebody could be due to them just not caring. Of course, that's true. But it's also the case that you have this social factor of the distribution of responsibility across people that influences your behaviors as well. So it seems to be a little bit more complicated than just a personal decision to help someone. And interestingly enough, research suggests that learning about the bystander effect can actually make you more likely to help people. So now that you know that you're going to feel less responsibility to help someone when you're in a bigger crowd, you can always recognize that in yourself, just like everything else we've talked about that's negative here. And you can fight against it. You can say to yourself, I don't feel as responsible to help this person. And the reason that is because there's so many other people around. But I'm going to choose to not listen to what my body is telling me to do, and I'm going to help the person anyway. So that's the way that you should feel about this. It's the way that you can counteract all of the negative effects of the social psychological phenomena that we've talked about so far. Is just understanding it, arming yourself with knowledge about it, and being able to make decisions to not let it influence the way that you think and behave is something that you're always capable of doing. Well, that's all I have for you. It was nice talking to you. I miss seeing all of you in person, and I hope you're all well. I hope that you're powering your way through this. Make sure that you are keeping up with the assignments. There's assignments that are still going to be due every week at the same times that they were going to be due otherwise. And also make sure that you're preparing for the next exam, which is going to take place. I'll have to look again, but I'm pretty sure it's next week. Just look at the calendar; it'll show you when the next exam is, and that's going to be just like the last one, except I'm going to make a couple of changes. I'm going to make it so you can go back to questions you've already answered, and I'm going to give you multiple attempts on the exam because this is just not a situation that's really advantageous right now, and I'm trying to make sure that we're all able to just get through this. Okay. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm still holding my office hours, so whenever you want to contact me to talk, just let me know, and we can do that. And just keep it moving. These are tough times, but we're gonna get through them. Okay. I'll talk to you all soon, and take care.